My Schizophrenic Life, The True Story of Tracy Poe, Part 6, WestPac 84, Part 3, Chapter 26, Thailand. We sailed north for about 3 weeks before we came to Pattaya Beach, Thailand. There is no port in Pattaya Beach, Thailand, just a beach, so the USS Peleliu LHA-5 anchored offshore, and money changers came on board from small bangka boats and set up on the fantail. Again, they called Liberty by unit, and our battery was one of the first units called. We made our way down to the fantail in the well deck. The back of the USS Peleliu LHA-5 opened with a big ramp, just like the USS Cleveland LPD-7. And after we exchanged our dollars for baht at a rate of 40 baht to the dollar, we walked out on the ramp on the rear of the USS Peleliu LHA-5. It was nighttime, and in the shadows all around the ship were what they called bangka boats. These were small boats 20 to 25 feet long, with a frigging house built on top of them, it looked like. They rocked bad. At the ramp on the back of the ship, the gunnels of the bangka boats would go 3 feet above the ramp and 3 feet below the ramp as they rocked. And you had to carefully time your jump into the bangka boat. Me and Lance Corporal Buchanan were on the same boat. Lance Corporal Batalon was on this bangka boat also. These bangka boats had a straight 6 engine in them, and you could see the propeller shaft turning slowly as the boat rocked and chugged along. It took 35 minutes to go less than a mile to shore. They served beer on these bangka boats, and Batalon had gotten him one. Batalon was Hawaiian, and a smiling Thai bangka boat crewman had taken a real interest in him. He was staring at Batalon, and every time Batalon would look in his direction, he would light up with a big smile. After what seemed like forever, the boat captain said we were there, but we were still about 30 yards from the shore. We all had to jump off the bangka boat into waist-deep water and trudge up to the beach. We were soaked, and all our money was wet. There were beach chairs and palm frond umbrellas all along the beach. Then, there was a small 3-foot concrete wall separating the beach from the street. Buchanan and I made our way to the street and walked down a block off the beach, turned left on the next road, and then left again and headed back to the beach. There were buildings all around, but on the street we were on, heading back to the beach, there was a large pavilion. In the parking lot, I did not see any cars. Of this pavilion were about 200 young women that were waiting outside. When they saw us walking, they began to all let out a joyous scream, and all came running towards us and surrounded us. We had to push through them to get back to the main street that ran along the beach. Along the main street of the beach, on the inland side of this street, were bars with open sides. Some of them were small with a few stools in front of a bar, and some were big and covered with a roof with open sides, and most of these larger establishments had a boxing ring visible from the street with kickboxers fighting in them. We ran into Pendleton and made our way together on down the street along the beach, until there were buildings on both sides of the street, and you could not see the beach anymore. We found a hotel. We had 6 days of liberty, and I did not have to be back on ship for 3 days when I had a fire watch. So, we got the best room in the hotel. It was a 2nd-story room with a balcony and had 2 beds and a couch bed. So, we rented it for 6 days. It was near to the King of Thailand's birthday, and there was a big painting of him outside our room. The beer was Singa beer and was laced with formaldehyde, so that drinking 2 of them was like drinking a 6-pack. I went exploring with Pendleton, and we had a few Singha beers and were really drunk when some children selling green grapes came up to us, and Pendleton asked how much for the grapes, and the girl said they were 40 baht for a kilo or $1 US. Pendleton said, "Well, give me 2 kilos," and the girl filled a large brown paper shopping bag full of grapes. We had more grapes than we knew what to do with. We ate a few and walked back down to our hotel. Pendleton was drunk and yelling like drunk Marines do. He was out on the balcony talking badly about their king and was out of control. I left to explore on my own. I went to a street vendor that had half chickens and shish kebabs and stuff on his table by his grill, and I saw a square rice cake in the back of his table. I told him I wanted that, and he said that that was for locals and I needed to get something else, but I demanded it. He reluctantly grilled the rice cake and put a butter sauce on it and gave it to me. It was delicious. I had heard about a Buddhist monastery up on the hill, so I walked all the way down to the end of the main road, which ended at a locked gate with a guard in a green uniform protecting it. I tried to ask him where the monastery was, but he did not speak English, and I do not know what he said, but he wanted me to go away. I went back to the hotel. As I was the junior lance corporal, I had the couch for a bed. Pendleton had passed out and Buchanan was asleep, so I crashed on the couch. I woke up early the next morning. I looked outside from the balcony and saw a few people standing in the street at dawn behind trays on stands. Then, Buddhist monks with shaved heads wearing orange robes came down the street individually, with 2 or 3 small boys following them. They would stop in front of the people at their trays, and the people would put cooked food in the plastic bags the monks were carrying. Each little boy carried a plastic bag also, and they would get food put in their bag as well. I saw them go up a side street that led up a hill. Later in the day, I went up this street and it opened to a road going up a hill, and there was fancy spirit houses every so often along the side of the road. I came to a courtyard that was lined with giant Buddha statues on either side, with an even bigger Buddha statue in the middle at the end of the courtyard. As far up as people could reach, there were gold foils stuck to all the Buddha statues. There was a vendor that sold soda, and I bought one. He put it in a plastic bag with a straw, just like in the park in Sembawang. There were shrines all over the place, and they all had incense burning in pots full of sand to hold the sticks. There were few people around, but occasionally you would see someone say a prayer and leave an incense burning. I explored the monastery most of the day and left in the late afternoon. I got back to the hotel and Pendleton and Buchanan were talking about getting some female companionship. At dark, I went with them to a bar, and they each found a young woman and were talking to them. The one Buchanan was talking to had stretch marks where she had given birth recently. I left and found a seafood restaurant out on the beach that had fish, crabs, and lobsters on ice in front of it. I picked out a big sea bass and had them cook it for me. The waiter asked if I was from the ship, and I told him I was from Bolivia. He told another worker there what I had said. The fish was delicious, and there were 3 sauces to dip it in. I slept out on the beach in a chair that night and the next morning went back to the hotel. Pendleton said he did not have an enjoyable time with the young lady. She was rather frigid and just wanted to get it all over with. I went out with Buchanan and was hungry again. I found an Indian restaurant and Buchanan and I went inside, and we sat down, and I ordered mutton curry like I had had in Sembawang. And like in Sembawang, the waiter asked if I wanted it hot, and I said, yes. Buchanan did not get anything to eat. It was a big mistake ordering it hot because it was so spicy. I could only take a few bites before I gave up. It was too hot. That night, Buchanan and I had to be back on the ship the next day, so we were waiting on the beach. We both had a fire watch the next day. We were sitting there and found out the banca boats would run in a few hours at dawn. A lady came up to us and started talking. She took us to a house built over a swamp that had a cool boardwalk leading to it just off the beach. We went inside and she pulled out a plate with marijuana on it. She asked if we wanted some, and we said no, because we knew there was a drug test after this liberty. She smoked a little bit of it and passed out. Before she passed out, she said we could sleep there and pointed to a cuckoo clock and said, "That will wake you up." We left and slept on the beach and caught the banca boat back to the ship. This time they had a long canoe that pulled up on the beach and took us to the banca boat just offshore. We both made it back to the USS Palilu LHA-5 with time to spare. After my fire watch, I got some real chow at the chow hall and slept in my rack until morning, then made my way to the fantail and caught the slow ride to shore in a rocking banca boat. When I got back to the hotel, I convinced Pendleton to go up the hill and check out the monastery. We made our way up the hill to the courtyard with the big Buddhas, and then found a shrine with golden Buddhas inside. A toothless man beckoned for us to go inside the shrine, and we did. It was awkward. When we exited, Pendleton pointed to his camera and then pointed to the old man who then pointed to himself. And Pendleton shook his head yes, and the toothless old man smiled from ear to ear and posed for a picture with no teeth. That night I convinced Pendleton and Buchanan to try the seafood restaurant on the beach. Buchanan and I had a fish each, and Pendleton picked out several rock lobsters. The same waiter was there, and he laughed at me and said, "I knew you were from the ship." That night was our last night in the hotel, and the next morning we were at the beach, and shortly later were on a banca boat headed back to the USS Palilu LHA-5. The first morning back on ship, at formation, they said, "Right face," and marched us down to a line in the hallway to take a drug test. I was clean. Chapter 27, Hong Kong. In December of 1983, We cross-decked by helicopter back to the USS Cleveland LPD-7, which had been repaired. We were at sea for Christmas of 1983. We had hung green socks around our berthing compartment like Christmas stockings with our names written on them, except for Corporal Foster, who had a proper red and white Christmas stocking. However, Santa did not find us that night as all the socks were empty the next morning. Shortly after Christmas, we sailed into Hong Kong Harbor. It was a big lighted city with tall buildings right up to the edge of the water. There were areas of the harbor that were full of barges with houses on them and people living on them like floating neighborhoods. We pulled into the harbor at night, and the whole area was lit up from the lights of the buildings. We pulled up to a dock and were released for liberty. Right off the dock, there was an establishment that had food and served beer. When I went through this building, there were Marines from Bravo Battery's FDC, Fire Direction Control Platoon, at a table drinking Anchor beer, and they would not let the waitress clear the empty cans and had them all stacked up in a big pyramid. The first day there, the Marines and sailors of our assault group were invited to the British Exchange, a department store run by the British Authority in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was still a British protectorate at this time, and control of it had not reverted to China, which was scheduled some years in the future. The exchange had everything. I bought a recorder, flute, that was excellent quality and made of wood. I bought a little meerschaum pipe and some tobacco. Pendleton was with me, and I showed the pipe to Lance Corporal Kopenick, and he said the tobacco would ruin it for smoking weed. Pendleton went off on him, berating him for suggesting the smoking of marijuana, for which we were routinely drug tested. I had gotten it for tobacco only. The exchange sold boxes of fine china tableware. An 8-placement set was $22. I picked out what I thought was a nice pattern and bought a box. The British Exchange was near the dock, and Command had arranged with a shipping company to let Marines and sailors who bought large items, mainly boxes of china, ship them back to the United States. The agency had set up on the dock near the USS Cleveland LPD-7. To do this, there was an extensive line. I did not want to wait, and so I took my box of china and put it on the foot of my rack. The rest of the float I slept with my legs bent when I slept on ship. I went out to explore Hong Kong. There was Hong Kong on one side of the harbor and Kowloon, China, on the other side. Supposedly Kowloon had the better shopping, so me and Pendleton wanted to go there. We got in a taxi, but the driver did not speak English. He gave the radio microphone to Pendleton, and Pendleton told the person on the radio where we wanted to go in English, and that person told the driver where to take us in Chinese. He drove us to Kowloon and let us out. The sidewalks were crammed with short people with black hair. There were so many people that at the crosswalks the mob would just surge into the street no matter what the lights said, and cars would have to slowly push their way through this throng. I was taller than all the people on the street, so I could see over their heads. And from 2 blocks away, I could see Lance Corporal Creech, the tallest Marine in our battery, wading through the sea of shorter people with black hair. He looked like Godzilla wading to shore. I got separated from Pendleton, and by myself went to a clothing store called Tutti Frutti, and bought a pair of brown designer pants that were thick cotton and had some strange decorative pleats in the front on each leg. I also bought a pair of low elf-looking black suede pull-on boots, and I bought a nice brown sweater. Somehow I found Pendleton again, and he had found Grom, and we all got a taxi back to the ship. Again, we had to talk on the radio and tell dispatch where we wanted to go, and that person told the driver. We went through a tunnel to get back to Hong Kong. As we came out of the tunnel, I said Hong Kong in general, as I was amazed that I was there, and the driver said, "Yes, Hong Kong side," meaning we were back in Hong Kong proper and out of Kowloon. The next day I put on my new clothing and my elven boots, and Lance Corporal Ross went crazy over them and wanted to get the same thing. So he asked me to take him to the shop where I bought them in Kowloon. I said we would have to get a taxi, and he said the subway was cheaper, so we took the subway to Kowloon. The cars of the subway in Hong Kong were articulated where they joined each other, and you could look down the train and see all the way down it. You could see when the train went around a curve or up or down a slope because the whole thing bent. I took Ross to the Tutti Frutti store, and he got pleated cotton pants and elven boots just like mine. The next day, we still had 2 more days in Hong Kong, and Buchanan asked if I would go with him to get a suit. They would make a custom suit in one night, and it would be ready 24 hours after you ordered it. We went to some shop in a tall building. The shop was several floors up. I do not know how he found it, But we went inside and they were measuring him, and I sat in a little waiting area and watched a Spider-Man cartoon in Chinese. After he ordered his suit, we split up and I found a phone I was told about and made an international call and talked to my father. It was 10 a.m. in Hong Kong, and it was 11 at night at my father's house. I went to a museum down by the harbor entrance. It had a planetarium with a show, so I went to get a ticket. The clerk told me the English show was over, and they had a Chinese show next. So, I said, okay, and bought a ticket to the Chinese show. I sat in the reclining chair looking up, and they had the star map, and a narrator started talking in Chinese, and I saw a dot of light standing for a star move across the dome screen, and the next thing I knew, everyone was walking out. I had fallen asleep and slept through the entire thing, which I could not understand anyway. The second to last day in Hong Kong, Lance Corporal Pendleton and I went to one of the Susie Wong bars near the dock. In the bar were young ladies, and two of them sat down with us. The young lady was sitting on my lap and bouncing. She was from Japan and could not speak English. The young lady with Pendleton translated for me. I ended up kissing her for a while. Pendleton made plans for us to meet them the next morning, but we did not go to meet them. Pendleton was worried that they would be upset. I thought nothing of it. This was our last day in Hong Kong, and I went back to the USS Cleveland LPD-7, and that night was New Year's 1984. Lance Corporal Lightman had a bag of candy from Hong Kong, and they were like root beer barrels but different. They had a plastic wrapper on each piece and then paper around the candy. We were picking the paper off the candies, but it was hard to do, and then Lightman said, "Oh my God, it is edible rice paper." And we began to eat them. We left Hong Kong Harbor that night, and there was a fireworks display over the harbor about 3 hours before we left. Chapter 28, Korea. From Hong Kong, we sailed north for a few weeks. It started getting cold. We would hardly ever go topside on board the USS Cleveland LPD-7 anymore. We started to have cold weather classes. They talked about the dangers of frostbite. They talked about peeling your dead toes off your foot, and it being so cold the poop would freeze in your bowels, and the corpsman would have to dig it out with his fingers to save your life. They made it sound terrible. They issued us cold weather gear. There were VB, vapor barrier boots that we called Mickey Mouse boots because they were big and bulbous. There were mittens with a separate trigger finger piece, liners for our field jackets, and knitted watch caps that were black. There was long underwear and cold weather sleeping bags. We got to Korea in mid-January and stayed there until mid-February, the dead of winter. We were to go ashore in Mike boats, and we were waiting for these boats in the well deck of the USS Cleveland LPD-7. Suddenly, they started to flood the well deck. First Lieutenant Adams ran over and dove into the Jeep to avoid the cold water landing on Pendleton and me. The water came up about 10 inches to a foot where our Jeep was in the front of the well deck, but as it went towards the back, it got deeper. There was a sailor stationed at the back of the well deck in rubber boots shuffling along to not splash the freezing water, trying to get to the ladder on the side of the well deck at the back. He got about 4 feet from the ladder when the freezing water went over the top of his rubber boots and flooded them. This slowed him down, and he climbed the ladder and left his position. Then they corrected the situation, and the water in the well deck receded. There were 3 Jeeps in our advanced party, and we backed onto the Mike boat which had pulled up to the ramp at the back of the ship. It was a short ride in the Mike boat to shore. We were some of the first Marines ashore, and the engineers were still in a vehicle unrolling a roll of flexible road surface for the trucks to drive on. We pulled up to the left of them in the Mike boat and tried to drive our Jeeps up the beach. The whole beach was round golf ball-sized rocks, and our Jeeps could not drive on them. They sank in the rocks up to the floorboards. All the Marines in the advance party had to go to each Jeep and literally carry it up the beach and out of the rocks, then go back for the second Jeep and repeat the process. The same for the second Jeep's trailer, and the same for the third Jeep, and the same for the third Jeep's trailer. We carried all the vehicles one at a time out of the rocks on the beach. Soon enough, we were on the road driving along. At the cold weather training classes, they made it sound like it would be a blizzard, but it was a nice sunny day in the low 40s. It was cold, but not as bad as they had made it sound. Korea was made up of small, rugged, steep, small mountains covered with small, scrubby pine trees. There were valleys in between the mountains, and they were all terraced for rice cultivation. We were on maneuvers, but this was not open terrain like most exercises. We were right in among houses and villages. We drove down a highway for a while. Then First Lieutenant Adams told us to turn left off the highway. We went up some sketchy roads up some small hills, and it turned out that the road ended at the top with nowhere to go. First Lieutenant Adams, Pendleton, and I got out and Corporal Powell backed down the sketchy hill, but his Jeep slid off to the side and he jumped out. We had to put a tow line on the Jeep and drag it back onto the sketchy road. We were told the aggressor force would be wearing red epaulets on their jackets. We were driving down a road and off to the right were some Marines across a rice paddy. I swear I could see red epaulets. So we asked the lieutenant if we should fire on them and he said, yes, we had blanks. So I went to fire my M16 on full auto and it went pow one time. I recharged it and it went pow one time again. It had frozen up. So Pendleton took his M60 and fired and it went pow one time. His M60 had frozen up also. By this time, the aggressor force had opened on us with several M16s and at least 2 M60s. We would have been killed if it were combat. We finally found the large rice paddy that the lieutenant was looking for and parked our Jeeps, and the advance party Marines waited by the highway for the trucks and guns to come. It got dark and it got cold, and still our trucks had not come. We waited with our red-lensed flashlights ready to signal our trucks to tell them to pull in this large rice paddy. Finally, we saw our truck's headlights coming down the road. We started feverishly blinking our red lights to signal them, but it was a line of civilian buses. Then we saw a truck and signaled it, and it stopped. Then Pendleton yelled, "It's a 5-ton," and started kicking it. The truck drove off. Our Bravo battery trucks were 2.5-ton trucks. After about 3 hours, our trucks and howitzers came down the highway, and we signaled them and led them into the position. Staff Sergeant Spittler took half of the advance party and put them on perimeter watch and let half of them get some sleep. We were taught not to sleep in our clothes while in the cold weather sleeping bag. You were to take off your utilities and lay them down in your sleeping bag and sleep on top of them. I was in the group going to sleep first, so I took off my utilities and jacket and laid them in my sleeping bag, then climbed on top. I had just got in and gotten warm when Lance Corporal High took a squad stove, a stove the size of a big thermos, and put too much gasoline in it and sat it next to me. And when he tried to light it, fire spread all around it, including the base of my sleeping bag. I yelled, "Put me out!" But I did not get out of my sleeping bag, and High stamped out the flames on me. We were supposed to get woken up at night to do some training, but it got canceled, and I slept all night and woke up in the morning. That morning, as Marines began to stir, there was a patch of ice on the ground in the rice paddy we were in, and Marines were skating on it in their VB Mickey Mouse boots. They held a formation, and then I was taken to a position by the road to the left of a smaller road that cut across the paddy towards a village that was next to the large rice paddy the trucks and howitzers were in. 3 of us took turns guarding that position for 2 days, with one of us always being there with Pendleton's M60 machine gun. One morning, I had to take a dump, so I got the shovel from my gun section and went off to the right of the position I was guarding and down in a dry creek bed and dug a hole and took a dump. As I was finishing up, I heard someone saying, "You." I looked up and saw where an infantry Marine had stood up in his hole. I looked around and saw more infantry Marines. There was a platoon of infantry in the ravine guarding our right flank, and I had taken a dump in front of them all. Later that day, I was still there with the M60 when a company of infantry force marched to a parking lot across the highway I was next to. Then one of the infantry Marines ran across the highway in the direction of our howitzers. I slung the M60 around and saw him run over to a gun section. There was something familiar in the way he ran. The Marines at the howitzer pointed him towards me, and he came running over. It was my friend David from 3rd grade who had joined the Marine Corps a month after I did. He was in 2nd Battalion 7th Marines, and they had been in Korea a month and were about to leave. I knew he was in Korea because I got a letter from him, but I never thought we would meet up. We talked for about 20 minutes, then some buses pulled up across the highway, and he ran back to his unit. Staff Sergeant Spittler came and told me to head over to my gun section, but he did not tell me the exercise was over and to take my gear there also. My gear was in the Jeep trailer. I still had Pendleton's M60 and he had my M16. They told us to fire off all our blanks, and the Marines in my gun section took turns firing the belt of blanks through the M60. The sound of blank firing attracted a bunch of local Koreans who came over and were aggressively gathering all the spent brass casings. The M60 uses a disintegrating belt that falls apart into pieces when you shoot rounds through it. A local man had gathered up these pieces and put them back together to form a belt again. Staff Sergeant Spittler saw him and thought he had a belt of live blanks and confronted him, but we told him that he had put the spent casings back on the belt and Spittler let him go on his way. The locals in Korea collected all our spent brass, and they also wanted our trash from the MREs, meals ready to eat. I was told they used the collected cardboard to start cooking fires. I got the M60 after they had fired all the blanks, and someone had taken the pin out of the trigger assembly to be a jerk, and the assembly came off in my hand. Then they said we were leaving, and I had to get in the truck without my gear. I was worried because Marines will not help you with your own stuff. They will leave it behind. When we stopped in a field for a little while, I jumped out of the truck and ran over to Pendleton, who was in the Jeep. He was calling me a spaz because I was freaked out about the broken M60 and not having my gear with me. They were laughing at me and calling me Spaz, like it was my code name like special operators have code names. They took a picture of me when I was freaking out, and in it you can see Grom with a big smile on his face and me looking worried. I got my M16 back from Pendleton and gave him his M60 and got my gear out of the Jeep trailer and went back to my gun section's truck. We drove the rest of the day and most of the night. In our truck was a pile of gear and we all lay in it trying to keep warm. We finally stopped at the Mountain Warfare School complex where the ROK Marines, Republic of Korea Marines, trained in mountain warfare. David, my friend from 3rd grade who was now in 2nd Battalion 7th Marines, had been there and told me about it when we had met up. The infantry companies went through a week-long course. We, as an artillery battery, went through an abbreviated 3-day course. It was night when we got there, and they took us to a big Korean-style barracks. It was an open room with 2 levels of shelves on either side. They were big enough for someone to lay on, and we put our sleeping bags on these shelves with our gear nearby and went to sleep for a few hours. In the morning, they gave us an MRE, meal ready to eat, for breakfast. The whole battery was in this one building, and we could all see each other from the shelves on either side, and soon everyone was bartering their food items for other items they liked better. We then went out for formation and then started training. The first part of the training was a class by the Korean commander of the school. I was in the back of the group of Marines gathered around him and could not understand him when he first started talking, but the lesson was clear. He first went over some bad knots to not use. He would say, "You take of the rope and make of the bight, fold the rope over on itself, put the end through the loop, and make of the half hitchy. Half hitchy, no good." And he showed how a half hitch will come undone when you jiggle the rope by tying a half hitch to a tree and shaking the rope until it comes loose. We were all issued a length of rope and a D-ring, and he taught us how to wrap the rope around us in a distinct way to make a Swiss seat and to tie it off with a bowline knot. We then spent the next few days running courses. The school was in a series of rugged small mountains with cliffs. The first day there was a course on rock climbing that had 6 stations where you used various techniques to climb a cliff. We were held safe by our Swiss seat, D-ring, and safety rope. Then later that day there was a cliff that we rappelled down, and they taught us to go down backward in a sitting position with the D-ring in the front and Australian style where we walked straight down face first with the D-ring in the back. The second day we rappelled off a rope bridge that simulated rappelling from a helicopter. We did this in both the normal position and face first in the Australian position. That same day we had to carry a big pulley up a mountain and then ride it down a zip line. On the last day we went on a mountain run. We went up a steep trail on a mountain and then along the crest of a series of mountain ridges. The view was spectacular. That afternoon we left Mountain Warfare School. We drove back during daylight hours, and it was scary. The trucks navigated narrow mountain roads that were treacherous. We drove until dark, and then on after dark a while. That night we came to Camp Muchuk. It was a compound with a wire fence around it and plywood buildings that had so many cots in them to put your gear under the cot, you had to lift it up from the end near the aisle. On the side of every building was a barrel of diesel fuel with a hose running inside to a diesel drip heater that looked like a potbelly stove. The chow hall had a line of tables where the cooks would set up food, and then big boxes around that you had to stand next to and eat. There were no chairs. The shower had a tent with a stove to undress in, and then another tent with pallets to stand on. They would turn on the warm water and get you wet, then turn it off. You would soap up and wash. Then they would turn on the water and let you rinse. There was no place for our trucks and howitzers, so we had to make a compound just outside the fence of the camp. We took shovels and pickaxes and tore down rice paddy berms to make ramps so we could drive the vehicles up. Everybody was wearing assorted cold weather gear, so they held a formation the second day we were there and outlined a prescribed uniform. The uniform was utilities, a field jacket, and a black knit watch cap. We were at Camp Muchuk for over 3 weeks and only left twice. There was nothing to do and morale was dipping, so they held a formation and Lieutenant Colonel Fagan told us we were there as part of the hardening process. Soon the heater in the tent outside the showers did not work. Marines would undress in the wooden buildings and then wrap their towel around themselves and run to the shower. Pendleton and I went to take a shower and Pendleton said, "Don't run, walk." And we would slowly walk in the cold to the shower tent as Marines were running by. We went out for a live fire exercise with the artillery of the ROK, Republic of Korea, Marines. We supplied ammunition for the howitzers. We pulled in and set our guns up and were ready to fire in under 2 minutes. The ROK Marines pulled up and they all went over to the side of their position and set up a field kitchen. The ROK Marines insisted on controlling the live fire as we were in a populated area. They stationed a ROK Marine at every gun section and they wanted him to double-check the settings on the gun sight. They had never seen a column meter before, which was the optic. We pointed our gun sight at that had columns of lines with numbers in it that you aligned the sight to. They just used aiming stakes set off in the distance. Captain Work came to our gun 6 on the end and tried to explain the column meter to the Korean officer. After a while, the Koreans gave up trying to micromanage the situation and would just give us a thumbs up when we were about to fire. We did a net strike in about a minute and pulled our trucks with the nets bundled on top into a line just to show off. The Koreans did not let us fire many rounds because they wanted to keep the ammunition. While we were live firing, we were in a dry riverbed. A taxi came driving through our position. Then a bus full of people drove through the position. The civilians apparently used the dry riverbed as a makeshift road. At the end of the exercise, we had a formation and the Korean ROK Marines had a formation across from us. They thanked us for all the ammunition and then we left and went back to Camp Muchuk. We were given 3 days of liberty in Seoul, Korea, and buses took us to a Hilton hotel in Seoul. I had a room to myself and never left the hotel to go out in town. I ate every day at the buffet that they had. That was enormous. Pendleton was eating there with me, and I went to get a raw oyster on the half shell, and the waiter came over and said he would get me good ones, and he put 3 on my plate when I only wanted to try 1. Pendleton then came up to get an oyster, and the guy started putting them on his plate, and I told him, "You have to get 3. Back at Pendleton's room, which I was visiting, Pendleton said, "Watch this," and called on the phone and asked for Cokes. Soon, a waiter came with room service and brought a 6-pack of Cokes in small glass bottles and put 1 in front of Pendleton and opened it. We took a tour to the DMZ, demilitarized zone, and rode in buses all the way to Panmunjom on the border of North Korea. On the drive up there, we went by huge anti-tank ditches dug across the horizon. On the road through these ditches, there was what looked like an overpass on a highway. But it was not a bridge. It was a huge concrete block that they could detonate explosives under, and it would fall and block the highway. There were many of these for a few miles as we went near the DMZ. We got to Panmunjom, and they had a presentation by the Army Guards, and they told us not to wave or make any gestures toward the North Koreans while we were there. There was a propaganda village you could see in North Korea, and they said it was only inhabited by 20 soldiers who raised the huge North Korean flag that you could see for miles. It hung on a structure that looked like an Eiffel Tower. The tour took us into the conference building that is right on the border with a table denoting the line of the border. There was a U.S. Army guard stationed at the small North Korean flag that was sitting on the table so nobody could mess with it. I went around the table so that I can say I have been to North Korea. When we left, there was a gate guarded by the Army, and the gate had a sign with the unit that guarded the area's motto on it, and it said, "In front of them all." We went on buses back to Seoul and back to the Hilton Hotel and a day later back to Muchuk. I never saw Seoul as I stayed in the hotel relaxing in comfort the whole time. We only left Muchuk one more time and went to a range and live fired our howitzers. They said there was a fire in the impact area, and I was told to go on a truck with others to put it out. When we got to the impact area, there was no fire anymore, so we left. I saw a Korean soldier kicking a mortar round that was sticking out of the ground made up of small rocks. I ran like hell. Then we went to a range and fired all our personal weapons. We were on a road next to a valley with targets and impact areas across the valley on the hills on the other side. We were firing M60 machine guns at man-sized targets and were firing the M203 40mm grenade launchers at a bald spot on a hill. Captain Work asked the lieutenant if the Koreans were gone yet, and they were. So he had the M203 40mm grenade launchers all fire in unison on command toward the targets that the M60s were firing at. The whole target area erupted in explosions and dust, and some of the targets disappeared after being blown down in the melee. There were locals selling food and drinks to the Marines there, but they all left quickly when Lance Corporal Brewer and Staff Sergeant Malo started firing the M2 Browning heavy machine gun mounted on one of the trucks that was deafening. We had been in Korea for over a month in the field, most of the time at Camp Muchak. We drove to the docks at Pohang, Korea, and the USS Cleveland LPD-07 was nowhere to be seen. So, we were waiting on the dock and a freezing wind was blowing off the ocean. To me, it was the coldest day I had in Korea. Everybody was freezing. We were there for a few hours. Then, the USS Cleveland LPD-7 came pulling in, and to everybody's dismay, they were blasting the Marine Corps hymn loud over the public address system. We all had to stand at attention, which is the golden rule when Marines hear the Marine Corps hymn. It made us even colder. We got on the ship, and the chow hall cooked us steak and lobster. A sailor said he would trade his steak for my lobster, and I gladly agreed as I do not care for lobster. My steaks were fine, but his lobsters were a little raw in the middle, but he ate them anyway. We sailed away and said goodbye to Korea. Chapter 29, Philippines, third time. When we got to the Philippines the third time, almost everybody had a girlfriend in port, us being there twice before in all, and they had money. But after a few days, they were borrowing money from me. To get back to base, you had to go through the main gate, and you could bring your girlfriend with you. But there was a second gate to get to the ships, and you could not bring your girlfriend through this gate. So, there were local women waiting for their men to come back from the ships hanging around this gate usually. Like 1 or 2 women would be standing there. One day I was going into town, and I went through this gate and Corporal Foster was there trying to get his girlfriend through but could not. So he saw me and put her hand in my hand and told me to take her to the Exchange Deli. The Exchange Deli served food and drinks and had an ice cream parlor. I would go there most every day and get a Jamocha-flavored ice cream. It was by a section of old wall called Spanish Gate. So, I took Foster's girlfriend there and went to ask her if she wanted anything, and she interrupted me saying, "Yes, I want a soda." So, I got her a fruit punch and an ice cream and waited for Foster, who returned after a while. He was very thankful that I had taken care of his girlfriend. Girlfriends were important to the Marines who went to town a lot. They did more things than just supply a good time. If a Marine with a girlfriend wanted to buy something in town, he would send his girlfriend to get it, because there was a 2-tiered price system. There was the low price that a local would pay, and the higher price a serviceman would pay. Girlfriends also kept their men safe by avoiding dangerous areas. I never had a girlfriend, but to the Marines that did, they were important. Marines would talk about their girlfriends who they had fallen in love with. They would say, "She is a good girl who was not a loose woman." They would say, "It was her first day at the bar she was working at." We would joke and say that they would say things like, "I saw her filling out the application to work at the bar. She is a good girl." Corporal Everett was in love with his new girlfriend and was saying all the usual things about her not being a loose woman and that he was engaged to be married. I remember seeing his girlfriend standing out by the second gate when I was leaving the ship after hearing him talk about her, and she looked like she was on drugs. Her eyes were big and glassy. So, in a week, most Marines had settled in with a steady girlfriend. And then it happened. An aircraft carrier battle group came into port. This was a bunch of new ships, which was bad enough on its own, but these guys had been off the coast of Lebanon ever since the bombing back in October, just sitting there, and had been at sea for 146 days without hitting any ports. It was now February, and they were loaded with money, having been paid at least 9 times while they were at sea. Most of the Marines in our assault force had lost their girlfriends overnight. I saw Corporal Foster, and he was angry, and his friend, my gun crew leader, Corporal Hart, was trying to calm him down. and Corporal Everett was broken and just looked whooped with a broken heart. I avoided these women, so I was fine. This third time in the Philippines, Pendleton and I did not go into town much. Pendleton showed me a place on base at a gym where you could get a proper massage. Not like in town with a loose woman. This was an old man who beat the crap out of you. I had never had a massage before, and this was a very thorough one that made me feel like a noodle when it was over. Lance Corporal Lightman had a custom broadsword made for him by an artisan in Olongapo. It was impressive. I knew where the shop was that he got it, but I had never been in it. So, in the last days of our liberty, I went there. There was a small counter in a little cubby hole of a shop and stairs going up to a dead end. All along the stairs were swords on each step leaning against the walls. There were katana-style swords and lots of Filipino-style swords. There was even a 2-foot butterfly knife that was treacherous to open. In the back I found a medieval-style broadsword. It was not as superbly finished as Lightman's custom order, but it was a solid broadsword. So, I bought it. For the end of the float, this being our last liberty call before we sailed back to Hawaii, Command threw us a battery party. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes, being Filipino, arranged the entertainment. There was more free alcohol than should be legal. There were strippers, women oil wrestlers, 2 dwarf boxers, and a live band. A few drunk Marines got on stage and tried to play the band's instruments, but it sounded terrible. Corporal Foster was taking pictures and saying he hoped we would run for office later in life so he could blackmail us. The strippers tried to pull Pendleton's shorts down, and Pendleton's body slammed the stripper trying it. Gunnery Sergeant Reyes took him aside and lectured him. This was the craziest party I have ever been to. Everybody in Bravo Battery was there, including the officers. Lance Corporal Pendleton and I spent most of the days at the base pool, lounging in the sun and working on our tan maintenance. I had a great tan. Our last night in port, I realized I had a ton of pesos that I had exchanged. I tried to exchange them back, but the guard would not even let me in the base bank where you could supposedly do that. So, Pendleton, Priglar, and I went out on the town and were going to try our best to drink at every bar on Magsaysay Drive. Whenever you went to a bar, women would sit down with you at your table. We started doing a ritual. We would order a drink, then we would single a woman out, and one of us would ask to pay her bar fine. Then another one of us would ask her also. Soon we were fake arguing over who would pay her bar fine. Then suddenly one of us would say, "Break!" and we would all get up and leave quickly. We did this repeatedly, all of us having pesos to get rid of. We went into one bar that we had never been in before, and Pendleton said, "Oh my God, this is an officer bar," and we quickly left. One time there were 3 women at our table, and they were asking what ship we were on, and Priglar told them the Lusitania, and they all started saying, "The Lusitania?" questioningly. We did not drink at every bar on Magsaysay Drive that last night, and I still had a bunch of pesos left over. We sailed out of the Philippines in March of 1984 for the last time. We headed back to Pearl Harbor and arrived just over 2 weeks later. Chapter 30. Tiger Cruise. We manned the rails coming into Pearl Harbor in our utility uniforms, and on the dock was a huge welcoming party full of Marine Corps wives and their families waiting for their loved ones to return from the 6-month deployment. All the married Marines were wearing their wedding rings again, and their wives were on the dock holding up signs. There were a lot of happy children who had not seen their fathers for 6 months. It was a magnificent sight. After WestPac 8384 was over, the USS Cleveland LPD-7 was scheduled to sail to its home port in San Diego, California. The Marines who were going to take leave back in the mainland United States could avoid having to pay for an expensive airline ticket from Hawaii by taking the Tiger Cruise. That is where the Marines who wanted could be assigned to the ship for the voyage back to San Diego, and their leave would start when they arrived in California. Pendleton and I, along with about 4 other Marines from the Bravo Battery, took them up on this offer, and when the rest of the Bravo Battery left Pearl Harbor and went back to K-Bay, we stayed behind and were attached to the ship. The ship was loaded with civilian cars in the well deck and had several private yachts tied down on the flight deck, along with some heavy equipment for the Navy like forklifts and bulldozers. After 2 days at Pearl Harbor, we set sail for San Diego. The ship went directly there. There was no zigzagging. We sailed in a straight line and we sailed fast. We had the run of all the empty Marine berthing compartments, and I could put the box of china on its own bunk and no longer had to sleep with bent legs. There was nothing to do for us Marines on board but sleep, go to chow, and work on tan maintenance. The time ticked by slowly as we were bored, but the ship made the journey in just over a week. The fat gunnery sergeant oversaw us, but we never saw him except at the ship's mandatory fat body exercise time the Navy had for overweight sailors on the ship. He never bothered us. We got to San Diego and had to man the rails coming into that port also. And again, there was a huge welcoming party for all the sailors this time. I had my clothing bag and one duffel bag and a box of china with me. All my other gear was taken back to K-Bay by the Bravo battery and put in storage. Pendleton and I shared a taxi to San Diego Airport. We got to the airport and went to the bar, but we got kicked out because I was only 20. After all I had been through, I could not drink in California. We each said goodbye and got on our flights, and I headed for Houston on the familiar 3-hour flight. My mother, father, and my brother met me at the airport. When I got out of the baggage claim, I had my duffel bag on my back using the shoulder straps. I had my clothing bag hanging off my duffel bag from the top of it, and I was carrying the box of china. I gave my brother the box of china and said, "Here, I brought you something." My sister-in-law still has that china set in her cabinet. I do not think she ever used it, and to this day, it is a complete set. I was back at my parents' house that night and home for 30 days of leave.